Colorado Territory, February 1872. The wind howled over the ridge as Declan Avery rode up the last snowy bend toward his homestead. Steam rising from his horse's flanks, and the sky bruised purple with dusk. After 3 days of trading in town, he was bone-tired and cold, but something made him pause as the barn came into view. The latch on the door swung loose, tapping in the wind. He narrowed his eyes. No one should be out here, not this far up the mountain. Declan slid from the saddle, boots crunching over snow and straw. He unsnapped the holster at his hip and stepped inside, letting the barn door creak open slow. A sudden rustle. He froze. In the far corner, half buried in hay, was a woman. Her dress was torn at the hem, her hair tangled around her shoulders, fingers white with cold. She startled like a deer when she saw him, scrambling back into the shadows. "Do not come closer," she said, voice hoarse. Declan held up both hands. "I will not hurt you." "You are freezing." The woman looked at him, her eyes wide and wet, breath shaking as it left her lips. "I will get you a blanket," he said, already moving toward the loft, "and something hot to drink." "I did not mean to trespass," she called after him, almost a whisper. He glanced back over his shoulder. "You can explain once you stop shivering." She sat wrapped in an old wool blanket by the stove in his cabin, her hands curled around a tin of warmed cider. She would not meet his eyes. Her lips were cracked. She looked like she had not eaten in days. Declan crouched beside the hearth, feeding another log into the fire. "Name, Daria," she said after a beat. "Daria Keller," he nodded. "Declan Avery." She looked up at him then, just for a second, like she had not expected him to give his name back. "How long were you in the barn?" "Since last night." "You are lucky you did not freeze." "I know." Declan poured her a bowl of stew, then set it on the table. "Eat. You can stay here tonight. We can figure out the rest later." When she finally slept curled on the cot under a mound of blankets, Declan sat in his chair by the fire, watching the snow fall through the window. Her boots were worn through at the sole. The skin on her hands was raw. She had not said where she came from, or why she was running, but she was running. He knew that look. He had seen it on men during the war, on widows who came west alone. He thought about waking her, asking more. But then she stirred, her hand curling beneath her cheek, and he let her be. By morning, the storm had passed. The sky was clear, and the world outside glittered with ice. Declan made coffee and split logs for the stove. When Daria stepped outside, wrapped in his old coat, she blinked slow at the sun. "You have a nice place." "Too quiet most days. I like quiet." She looked better with food in her and sleep behind her eyes, still tired, still cautious, but not trembling anymore. "I will not stay long," she said. "I just needed shelter," he finished. "That is allowed." She looked at him like he had said something foreign. That afternoon, he found her trying to patch her shoe with twine from the barn. He knelt beside her in the straw and gently took the boot from her hand. "I have extras. Yours are not fit for walking. I cannot take your things." "You are not taking, I am giving." Her eyes filled again, though she blinked quick to keep the tears back. "Why are you being kind to me?" Declan stood. "Because someone should be." They spent the next 2 days in rhythm. He chopped wood, she swept the cabin. She mended the tear in her dress with an old needle she found in his chest. At night they sat by the fire, trading quiet words over stew. She told him she had grown up in Kansas on a farm near Topeka. Her voice caught when she spoke of her father. "You left recently?" he asked. 3 weeks ago." "Alone," she hesitated. "I had to." That was all she said. On the third morning, Declan found her out by the fence line, staring into the trees. She looked pale. "You expecting someone?" he asked, coming up beside her. "No," she hugged her arms around herself. "But someone might be looking." Declan frowned. "You in trouble, Daria?" She nodded slowly. "I did not steal and I did not lie, but I ran." "That is not a crime." "It was to the man I was supposed to marry." Declan's mouth tightened. "Did he hurt you?" She looked away. "He was cruel." He smiled in front of others, but behind closed doors he was not the man he pretended to be. "My father said I had to marry him anyway. Said it was settled." "So you ran?" "I had to." Declan's hands curled into fists at his sides. "I do not want to drag trouble to your home," she said. "I can leave today. You are not going anywhere." She turned to him, startled. "You are safe here," he said, steady. "If anyone comes looking, they will find me first." Daria's eyes filled again, but this time she did not blink it away. She stepped into him without a word, pressing her forehead against his chest. Declan wrapped his arms around her, holding her like something fragile, something that needed keeping. She did not tremble anymore. That night she sat across from him, the firelight catching the curve of her cheek, the softness of her mouth. He watched her laugh at something he said, and the sound was like a match struck in the dark. He had not heard that sound in so long, not in his house. She caught him looking. "What?" she asked, a small smile playing at her lips. "Nothing," he said, but his voice was quiet. She tilted her head. "You look like you want to say something." "I do," he said, "but I will wait until you are ready." Daria looked at him for a long time, then she nodded slow. "Thank you." But the way she said it, soft, warm, full of something she could not yet name, told him she was already halfway there. Daria stood in the doorway with her hands tucked into the sleeves of the coat, watching the slope of the mountain catch the morning light. A pair of mule deer moved through the scrub at the edge of the tree line, and she didn't call out, only watched in stillness. Declan stepped around her to set down the bucket of water he'd hauled from the creek. His shoulders were wet where snow had melted through his shirt, but he didn't seem to mind. "You sleep all right?" he asked, brushing melted flakes from his collar. She nodded. "I dreamed I was back in Kansas." But it wasn't a bad dream. He studied her face carefully, like her answer held more weight than she'd said aloud. "You ever think of going back?" he asked. "I did once. Thought about writing to my aunt in Salina. But she's got 4 boys and a husband who wouldn't take kindly to me showing up with nothing but a name and a satchel." Declan picked up a length of rope from the porch rail, coiling it absently. "You've got more than that." Daria looked at him, brow creased. "What do you mean?" "You've got your hands, your mind, and you've got grit." He glanced at her. "That counts for something out here." She didn't answer, just turned her eyes back toward the trees. Later, while he laid fresh straw in the stall, Daria took up the kettle and busied herself near the stove. She moved slower than she had the day before, but steady, her fingers more sure in their work. When he came back in, the cabin smelled faintly of sage and boiled oats. "There's a woman down in the valley," Declan said, pulling off his gloves. "Widow named Harmon, keeps a few goats and sells soap. She's always looking for someone to help with stitching or rendering. I can work." Daria poured the thin porridge into 2 bowls. "I always have. You'd ride with me tomorrow if you want. Meet her." She nodded slowly, then passed him a bowl. "You don't think she'd mind what I ran from?" "She minds the truth more than appearances," he said. "And she's had to start over herself." They ate in quiet, the stove ticking softly beside them. Outside, the snow had begun to soften under the sun, turning the packed drifts to slush around the eaves. Daria set down her spoon. "Do you get many visitors this far up?" "Only the ones who mean to find me." She wrapped her fingers around the edge of the bowl. "And if someone did come asking questions," Declan leaned back in his chair, "they'd have to do it from the bottom of the hill." "I don't answer to men who come uninvited." Daria looked at him across the table, something unreadable in her face. "I didn't know men like you existed," she said finally. "I'm not much different than others." "You are to me." She said it so quietly he wasn't sure she'd meant for him to hear. That evening, she sat on the porch mending a tear in one of his shirts, while a pair of magpies chased each other through the bare cottonwoods. He came up from the creek with a brace of trout and paused when he saw her there, the needle moving clean through the fabric, her brow furrowed in concentration. "You don't have to do that," he said, setting the fish on the bench beside her. "I know," Daria replied, not looking up. "But I want to." He sat beside her, watching her fingers move. Her hands, though still healing, worked with quiet skill. "I used to mend my father's shirts," she said. "He'd tear them hauling sacks, said I had the smallest stitches in Douglas County." Declan smiled faintly. "He sounds proud." He was, in the way some men are, said everything through work, never words, he nodded. I understand that. She looked at him, eyes catching the gold of the low sun. I don't mind quiet, Declan. Not when it means something. He didn't speak, only reached for the knife at his belt and began cleaning the fish while she finished the last seam. That night, with the fire low and her chair pulled near his, Daria rested her head against the worn wood of the wall. I didn't think I'd feel safe again, she said. Declan glanced over, voice low. You do now, she nodded. I do. He watched her a moment longer before turning back to the fire. The coals glowed soft and red, and outside the wind had stilled, neither of them moved to rise. The road down to the valley had softened just enough to take the wagon, though the ruts still held patches of ice beneath the melt. Declan drove slow, reins light in his hands as the mule picked its way along the narrow cut. Daria sat beside him beneath a thick wool cloak, her face turned toward the sun, quiet but not withdrawn. You ever drive a team? He asked, eyes on the slope. My uncle taught me with his old mare and a cart too short to turn properly, she said. I ended up in a fence post the first time. He laughed so hard he near fell off his porch. Declan grinned to himself. Sounds like a good man. He died last spring. She paused. It was the only letter I got all year, just the word gone and a date, nothing else. The mule snorted as it stepped over a downed branch. Daria adjusted her grip on the sideboard, watching the trees thin ahead. I was supposed to marry the man before Uncle passed, she said. There was no one left to say no after that. Declan didn't speak. He didn't ask for names, just let the silence stretch out until she filled it. I thought maybe I could live with it, that I could make my peace with the kind of life he wanted. But I woke the morning after we signed the papers and couldn't breathe. I put on my boots and didn't stop walking until the sun came down. A crow lifted from a pine limb above them, wings cutting the air. Declan flicked the reins gently. You did more than most would have dared. I didn't feel brave. I felt hollow. Hollow can still carry you out of a place. They rolled into the valley as the sun crested noon, the Harmon place marked by a crooked plank fence and a pair of smoke trails rising from behind a sod-roofed lean-to. A woman with a braid wound tight around her head stood at the gate with a pail in one hand and a long-handled knife in the other. You bring me help or trouble, Avery? She called. Bit of both, likely, Declan replied, stepping down. The woman's gaze landed on Daria, assessing but not unkind. You got good hands. Daria climbed down without waiting. I can sew, cook, and split tallow without gagging. Mrs. Harmon gave a single nod. Then you're hired. Inside, the place smelled of lye and rosemary, the table stacked with wrapped bundles of soap and rows of drying cheesecloth. Daria rolled up her sleeves without being asked and set to work at the bench, tying bundles while the widow poured boiling water over a basin of rendering fat. From the doorway, Declan watched them fall into rhythm. Daria didn't flinch at the smell or the heat. Her braids slipped loose as she leaned over her work, and she didn't stop to fix it. After a while, Mrs. Harmon nudged him with the flat of her knife. She's good. You best keep her safe. I plan to, Declan said. Daria rode home with a satchel full of coin and a bar of soap pressed into her palm. She held it tight, not as if it were money but something rarer. I haven't earned pay in 5 years, she said, voice low. He didn't answer. Just looked at her hands, pink from the work, and felt something shift in his chest. That evening, while he boiled water for washing, she stood by the hearth, holding the soap up to the light. You said you built this place after the war, she said. Why so far from town? I didn't want to be found. She turned to him, curious without pressing. I was a scout, he said. Used to riding alone. After I didn't know how to be around folks anymore, so I didn't try. Daria stepped closer. You ever miss it? Sometimes. He gestured at the window. But then the wind changes and I remember why I left. She reached out, placed the soap on the table beside his hand. I know what it is to want to disappear. You don't have to disappear anymore. Neither of them moved for a long moment. Then she dipped her head and her voice came quiet. I don't want to. That night, she washed her hands with the soap she earned herself and dried them on one of his old shirts, and when she came to sit beside him, she didn't ask permission. She just reached for his hand like it was the most natural thing in the world, and he let her. By early March, the thaw had reached the high pass. The snow along the ridgeline receded into patches, revealing the dark, wet earth beneath. Water ran in thin streams down the slope behind the cabin, and the mule stood belly deep in mud by the fence, nosing the newly green shoots. Daria stood at the washboard, sleeves rolled to the elbow, her fingers red from the cold stream water. She didn't flinch when it bit her skin. The motion of scrubbing had become its own rhythm, steady and without thought. Declan was splitting kindling behind her, the axe swinging in a clean, practiced arc. "You always work alone?" she asked, not looking up. "Mostly." She set a wet shirt onto the line, weighing it with a stone. "You ever think about hiring on help? Someone to keep the place running if you took sick?" His next swing struck short, the blade thudding into soft wood. "I've thought about it," he said. "But I never liked the idea of folks relying on me." She paused, hands still at the line. "Doesn't seem like that stopped you with me." He didn't answer right away. The wind moved through the trees above them, stirring loose bark and old leaves. "You didn't ask for anything," he said finally. "You just needed a place to land." She turned then, wiping her hands on her skirt. "That's not all I need anymore." Declan met her eyes. She didn't look away. "Come inside," he said. "You're shaking." Inside, the fire was low but steady. She rubbed her hands near the heat, and he poured what was left of the morning's coffee into 2 tin mugs. They stood facing each other, steam rising between them. "I've been thinking about the Harmon place," she said. "She offered more hours, said I could work through spring if I wanted." "You should." She asked if I planned to stay this far up the mountain. I told her I didn't know. Declan watched her carefully. "And now, I don't want to leave." He didn't move, but something in his shoulders eased. "I'd have to earn my keep," she added. "I can keep on with her and I can help here. This place doesn't run itself." He nodded once. "There's always work." She stepped closer, holding the mug between both hands. "I've been waiting to feel ready," she said. "But I think that might not ever come, not in the way I thought. Sometimes you just have to choose." Declan set his mug down on the mantel. "You already have." She looked up at him, the faintest edge of fear still in her eyes. "If I stay, it's not just for the roof." "I know. I don't want to be a burden, you aren't." They stood close now, without touching. Then she reached up, slow, and rested her hand against his collarbone, where the fabric of his shirt was still warm from the sun. "I've never had someone wait," she whispered. "I've never had someone worth waiting for." She leaned into him then, and he held her, the kind of hold that didn't ask or demand, just steadied. Her breath caught once against his shoulder, then settled. Later, she sat at the table with his ledger open in front of her, squinting at the neat but faded numbers. "You keep good records," she said, tapping a figure with her fingertip. "Old habit." "I can help with this too. I kept books for years. My father's farm, then later," she paused. "I can keep them again." Declan sat across from her, watching her trace the columns. "Daria," he said. She looked up. "This place was empty for a long time. I stopped expecting anything to fill it." She closed the ledger. "Well," she said, "you'll have to make room now." "I'm not leaving." He reached across the table and took her hand, the one still pink from the wash water, the one that hadn't stopped moving since she'd arrived. This time, she didn't pull away. By late April, the last of the snow had melted from the bluff behind Declan's cabin, leaving the hillside soft and green with early grass. Daria stood at the edge of the clearing with a pail in one hand, watching a pair of bluebirds dart between the branches of a young aspen. She wore a linen apron stitched from an old feed sack, and her braid had begun to fray at the bottom from the wind. A quietness had settled into her bones, not the silence of fear or waiting, but a kind of peace she hadn't known existed. Declan stepped out from the barn, wiping his hands on a cloth. "That fence by the east line needs mending. I was thinking to start tomorrow." "I can help with that," she said. "I've got calluses now. You've had them." She looked down at her hands, the faded scrapes along her knuckles, the missing thread from her sleeve. They feel different here. Like they belong to me. That night, she brought in the jar of salt pork she'd traded for at Mrs. Harmon's and tucked it into the pantry beside a row of dried apples. Declan was at the table, carving notches into a strip of pine, the beginning of a new tool handle. She set the pantry door closed with the back of her hand and crossed the room. "Declan." He looked up. "I want to show you something." She reached into the old satchel she'd kept beneath the cot since the day she arrived. He'd never once opened it, and pulled out a folded piece of muslin. When she laid it on the table, it unfurled into a half-finished quilt square, the stitching fine and precise, though the colors had begun to fade. "My mother started it the year I turned 12, she said. "After she passed, I took it with me. I never finished it. Every place I stopped, I thought I would, but I didn't." Declan ran a thumb along the edge. "It's beautiful." "I was thinking," she said, fingers tightening around the fabric, "maybe it's time I finished it. Here." He nodded, quiet. She looked at him, unsure for the first time in weeks. "Would that be all right? I'd be proud to see you finish it here." The next morning, they rode down to the Harmon place with a basket of dried herbs and a small sack of flour. Daria walked ahead with Mrs. Harmon while Declan lingered by the mule, checking the harness. When they returned to the cabin, Daria carried a small parcel wrapped in muslin. She waited until they'd unloaded the wagon, then handed it to him wordlessly. Inside was a worn book of scripture, its cover cracked with age. "It belonged to my uncle," she said. "He read from it every Sunday. Said a home wasn't real until it had something sacred in it." Declan turned it over in his hands, then looked at her. "Will you read it with me?" Daria nodded. They read the first page that night, seated side by side beneath the oil lamp. She curled her feet beneath her and leaned into his shoulder, her voice soft but steady as she moved through the verses. When she finished, she set the book aside and looked up at him. "I've been thinking about planting a garden," she said. "There's space behind the shed. The soil's good. What would you grow? Carrots, maybe beans, something stubborn." Declan reached for her hand, his fingers warm and calloused. "That sounds just right." In early May, they built a new coop for the hens, and Daria hammered the nails without flinching. She laughed when one bent sideways, and he looked over at her, struck by the sound. Not because it was rare now, but because it had become familiar. That night they sat on the porch, watching the stars come out one by one. "We've been through winter," she said. "And I didn't leave. You stayed," he said. "Not because you had to, because you chose to." "I think," she said, "I'd like to keep choosing this." He turned toward her, the light from the lantern catching the edge of his jaw. "You think or you know," she smiled, and this time it came without hesitation. "I know." Declan reached for her then, not with urgency but with certainty. He cupped her face with one hand and she leaned into it, her eyes closed. When he kissed her, it wasn't a question, it was an answer. They married beneath the cottonwoods, with Mrs. Harmon standing as witness and a pair of doves watching from the fence. Daria wore a dress she had mended with her own hands, and Declan shaved for the first time in a month. They said their vows with no preacher, only the land around them and the quiet between their words. Afterward, they shared bread and honey at the table, and Declan pressed a small wooden box into her hands. Inside was a sewing thimble carved from pine, its edge rounded smooth. "For finishing the quilt," he said. She didn't cry, not then. But she held it like it was more than wood. They planted the garden together that spring, and by June the first shoots had come through. The cabin filled with the smell of sun-warmed herbs and wood smoke, and every evening they read from the book her uncle had left behind, their chairs pulled close. They never left the mountain. In the years that followed, the garden grew wider. A second room was added to the cabin when the winters proved harder. And one day, a child's cry echoed from within those walls, a sound that bound them tighter than anything ever had. Daria hung her mother's quilt on the wall above the hearth, the last square stitched in the shape of a rising sun. And when neighbors came through with questions or stories, they always said the same thing about the Averys up on the ridge. They built something strong, and they built it together.